It was a quiet Saturday morning at Jefferson Park in New Hampshire, just like every other weekend. In the northeast corner of the park, Margaret Hayes sat in her usual spot. She always came around 9 a.m., with a small box of freshly washed strawberries, a book resting on her lap, and a gaze that seemed to drift farther away with each passing day. Margaret was 68, a former Army nurse who had served in Iraq in 2003. She retired at 46 after a landmine blast hit the Humvee she was riding in, leaving her with permanent spinal injuries. She had been in a wheelchair ever since. The chair was old, its handles worn smooth, patches of paint long gone, but she never once complained. She lived alone now. Her son had died in a car crash on his way to work. Her husband had passed years before from lung cancer, most likely caused by toxic exposure during his deployment in Kuwait. Sometimes, she would wake up in the morning, stare at the old black and white family photo on the wall, and sit in silence for hours. That morning, the skies over Jefferson were clear and bright. Margaret rolled slowly along the gravel path. The yellow daylilies bent slightly as her wheels passed by, and an elderly man in a faded cap looked up from his Washington Post and gave her a gentle nod. She nodded back and smiled softly. She had grown quieter with age, found comfort in silence more than words. She parked herself beneath the tall oak tree, where the sun filtered down through layers of green like golden lace. The strawberry box still half full on her lap. Her eyes settled on the lake in the distance, where her son once left from the dock to rescue a drifting wooden boat. Some places remain loud with memories, even in their silence. They say soldiers carry wounds that words cannot reach. Margaret was living proof. Some nights, she burned the last of her son's letters in the backyard fire pit, as if releasing them would send them where her words could not follow. At 9:15 a.m., the old bell tower across the park rang out, just as a group of young women appeared from the other end of the path. They were dressed in flashy outfits, phones in hand, filming TikToks and giggling loudly. Their laughter, sharp and careless, sliced through the stillness like a car horn in church. They spotted Margaret. One girl smirked and muttered, "Look, it's some antique from the war." The others giggled harder, whispering just loud enough to sting. Margaret stayed still, not because she didn't hear, but because she had faced worse. Much worse. She had tended to screaming boys in dust-covered uniforms while bombs fell nearby. These girls weren't the storm, just the wind. One of them walked closer, stood directly in front of her, and sneered, "You deaf or just dead inside?" Margaret looked up. Her eyes, though tired, didn't flinch. The girl hesitated, shifted her gaze away, and half laughed to cover it. And then, that's when it began. The sun had just begun to rise higher in the sky, casting longer shadows beneath the trees of Jefferson Park. Birds chirped overhead. The lake shimmered in the distance, and somewhere behind the ice cream cart, a little boy was laughing with his grandfather. Life continued its quiet rhythm, until it didn't. Margaret Hayes, still seated beneath the old oak tree, adjusted the corner of the small quilt draped over her lap. The girls were still nearby, still giggling, but now the tone had changed. It wasn't laughter anymore. It was mockery, sharp, pointed, cruel in a way only youth and ignorance can be. One girl, wearing tight jeans and a pink top, stepped forward. She had a phone in one hand and an energy drink in the other. "So what's your story, Grandma?" she asked, voice dripping with sarcasm. "You think that chair makes you look noble or something?" The others laughed louder. Margaret didn't respond. She didn't need to. She'd learned long ago that not every battle required a weapon, and silence, used properly, could be the most powerful shield. But silence, to the young and shallow, often felt like weakness. Another girl leaned down, so close Margaret could smell the artificial vanilla from her lip gloss. "Are you ignoring us? Or just too old to hear anything?" she hissed. Margaret met her gaze. Calm, unafraid. That's when the third girl stepped forward, taller, bolder, the one who always needed to be seen. She didn't say a word. She just walked up, raised her hand, and slapped Margaret hard across the face. It was quick, brutal, loud enough to echo beneath the oak branches. And then nothing. No scream. No cry, no pushback, not from Margaret. She sat still, completely still. The side of her face turned slightly red. Her hands remained folded in her lap. The girls laughed again, but even they could feel something had shifted, because Margaret wasn't humiliated. She wasn't shocked. She wasn't even angry. She was still like a battlefield right before the smoke clears. Still like the moment between thunder and lightning. Still like someone who's seen real horror and knows this isn't it. It was that silence that changed the air. At the far end of the park, a man in a Marine Corps ball cap slowly stood up. He was tall, weathered, with a limp in his right leg and a service dog by his side. He didn't say anything. He just looked. Beside the fountain, an older couple, both Vietnam veterans, wearing faded jackets with unit patches, paused mid-conversation. The woman placed her hand on her husband's arm and turned toward the oak tree. Behind the hot dog stand, a retired Air Force pilot set down his walking cane and narrowed his eyes. The vendor beside him muttered, "Is that?" And then came the movement. One by one, without a word, they began to walk. Veterans, grandparents, joggers who had paused mid-stride, mothers holding their children's hands, a police officer on his lunch break. Even the teenager who had been scrolling through his phone stopped and looked. They all began drifting toward Margaret. It wasn't a rush. It wasn't dramatic. It was slow, deliberate, silent. Within 2 minutes, the entire park had changed. The laughter was gone. The music playing from someone's speaker faded to the background. The breeze no longer carried joy. It carried memory. A circle had formed around Margaret and the group of girls. Dozens of people, standing shoulder to shoulder, watching, not yelling, not scolding, just watching, with the kind of eyes that say, "We saw what you did, and we will not forget it." The girl who slapped Margaret shifted her weight. "What?" she snapped, her bravado slipping. "What are you all looking at?" Nobody answered. Margaret finally looked up, scanned the faces around her, and gave the slightest nod. That was all it took. The man in the Marine cap stepped forward. "Miss Hayes," he said gently, voice gravelly from age and memory. "You all right?" She smiled small, steady. "I've been through worse, Sergeant." His jaw clenched. "I'm sure you have, but you won't go through this alone." The girl in pink looked around, suddenly aware that her phone was no longer recording. No likes, no comments, just eyes. So many eyes, and none of them amused. A young father spoke from the crowd. "You think it's funny to hit a woman in a wheelchair?" A mother added, "That woman saved lives overseas while you were learning to walk." Still, no one raised their voice. And that was the part that made it all heavier. Margaret slowly turned her wheelchair. She didn't demand anything, didn't accuse. She simply looked at the girl who hit her and asked, "Did that make you feel powerful?" The girl blinked, her mouth opening, but no sound came out. "That slap," Margaret continued, "will fade from my cheek, but the shame you just earned, that stays." The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't need to. The sound of a heart breaking is quieter than a clap. The girl took a step back, another, then turned and started walking away. The others followed, faces red, necks stiff with pride and fear. But every step they took away from that oak tree felt like 1,000 miles. Margaret adjusted her blanket again. "Thank you," she whispered to no one in particular. The Marine veteran stood beside her. "You don't owe thanks, ma'am. You wore the uniform. That makes you family." And as the crowd slowly began to disperse, return to benches and blankets and conversations, the park felt different, changed, because sometimes justice isn't about shouting or fighting. Sometimes it's about standing, watching, witnessing, and reminding the world that respect isn't optional, especially not for those who have already paid a price we'll never understand. The crowd had not yet fully returned to their previous lives, though the group of girls had turned and begun to drift away, some slowly, some hurriedly. The tension still hung in the summer air. It wasn't rage anymore. It was reflection. Margaret Hayes remained where she was, beneath the old oak tree, her hands folded gently in her lap. The mark from the slap had begun to fade, but the quiet weight of what had happened still lingered. She could feel it in the air, in the stillness of the trees, in the quiet footsteps around her. A few people remained nearby, veterans mostly. The man with the Marine Corps cap stood silently at her side. 2 Vietnam-era nurses sat on the bench behind her, watching with knowing eyes. The park, usually filled with motion and chatter, had taken on the silence of a courtroom. That's when Margaret did something unexpected. She raised her hand slightly, just enough to motion toward the girls, who hadn't quite left the park's main path yet. Her voice, when it came, was calm, but steady enough to stop them. "Wait," she said. The 3 girls turned hesitant. The one who had slapped her wouldn't meet her eyes. Another girl, the youngest of them, looked like she wanted to cry but didn't know how. Margaret gestured. "Come back for a moment, please." The crowd shifted again. No one spoke. All eyes returned to the space beneath the oak tree. The girls stood still for a second longer. Then, almost as if carried by the weight of something larger than themselves, they turned around and slowly walked back. Margaret didn't scold. She didn't raise her voice. She looked up at them, her face soft with age, lined by years of sorrow and strength. She let the silence sit for a beat, then spoke. "I don't want you punished," she said simply. "I'm not here to ruin your names or ask for an apology. I just want you to understand something." The girls glanced at one another. The one who had laughed earlier now looked more like a child than a bully. Margaret continued. "When I was 23, I was stationed at a field hospital in Fallujah. We'd see boys come in with limbs gone, eyes wide with shock, some of them barely old enough to shave, and I held their hands. I gave them morphine. I wrote letters to their mothers when they couldn't. I did it because I believed in something bigger than myself." She paused. No one dared move. "I didn't go to war to be admired. I didn't expect a parade. But I did it so you," she looked directly at the girl who had hit her, "could grow up in a country where you're safe enough to laugh in a park on a summer morning." The girl looked down at her shoes. Margaret's voice lowered, almost to a whisper. "But I have to wonder." She leaned forward slightly, the old wheelchair creaking beneath her. "If this country ever needed people to stand up again, to serve, to sacrifice, would you be brave enough to do it?" It wasn't said with malice. It wasn't a taunt. It was a question, a sincere, haunting one. The silence that followed was not awkward. It was heavy, sacred. The youngest girl began to cry, just quietly, her hand trembling near her cheek. Another took a step back and then, overwhelmed, turned and walked away in silence. The one who had delivered the slap stared at Margaret, jaw clenched, lips tight, as though searching for something to say, but finding nothing. Then, with a breath that sounded more like a sob, she whispered, "I didn't know." Margaret smiled gently. "Now you do." No applause, no cheers, just the sound of the wind stirring the leaves overhead. Margaret turned her gaze back toward the lake. "I've seen what hate does when left unchecked," she said, mostly to herself. "I've seen what happens when people forget we are all human first." She looked at the girl again. "You don't need to carry shame forever, but you do need to carry responsibility." The girl nodded slowly, then turned and left, this time not in arrogance, but in reflection. As the girls disappeared down the path, the Marine veteran beside Margaret placed his hand gently on her shoulder. "That was more than they deserved," he said. Margaret shook her head. "No, that was exactly what they needed." The small crowd around her began to thin. A few came to her side and thanked her. One mother wiped away tears as she whispered, "My daughter was watching all of that. I hope she never forgets it." A boy about 10 years old, wearing a Yankees cap too big for his head, walked up to Margaret. "Are you a hero?" he asked. She looked at him, surprised. "No," she said after a pause, "but I've served alongside many who were." He nodded solemnly, then ran back to his father. And just like that, life in the park resumed, slowly, softly. But it wasn't the same, because something had been said that couldn't be unsaid. Something had been asked that couldn't be ignored. No one needed to raise a fist. No one needed revenge. Honor had spoken, and the whole world had listened. If today's story touched your heart, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Each subscription not only gives us the motivation to keep sharing these meaningful stories, but it also helps preserve the memories, the lessons of respect, compassion, and honor that matter most. Feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments below. We truly value every word you share. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to seeing you in the next story.